stunned on live television. Under the blazing lights of a nationwide broadcast, she stared directly at a journalism legend and exposed the painful failures of the press without blinking. Millions watched as she delivered a single sentence that shook the very foundations of American media. What happens when one woman dares to confront the old guardians and refuses to back down? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The floodlights bathed the set of America at the crossroads in a cold, clinical glare, making every breath visible, every glance electric. The network had billed it as a clash of eras, but no one in the control room could predict just how volatile the collision would be. At center stage, Dan Rather emerged from the shadows, his figure erect, his silver hair catching the light like a crown. He moved like a monarch in exile, still exuding the gravity of a bygone age. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, sharp and still, her tailored navy suit cutting through the sterile air like a blade. Her eyes, dark and steady, locked onto Rather's with a quiet fury, as if daring him to underestimate her, to mistake her youth for weakness. The two figures framed against the massive backdrop of an American flag seemed almost mythic, like warriors summoned by history itself to settle an old unspoken debt. In the control booth, a producer whispered, "Go live in 3 is 2." But it was already too late. The tension had taken on a life of its own, stretching through the cables, the walls, the millions of television screens now flickering to life across the nation. This wasn't just a political debate. This was a crucible where old power would be forced to answer to new truth. And Jasmine Crockett, armed with history, anger, and impossible poise, was ready to ignite it. As the last echoes of the opening fanfare faded into a silence sharp enough to cut glass, Dan Rather leaned forward slightly, the weight of decades behind him, and prepared to strike the first blow. With a slow, deliberate motion, he adjusted the stack of crisp notes before him. Notes he barely needed but kept anyway. A relic of an era where preparation was armor and performance was warfare. The cameras caught the subtle shift in his posture, the tightening of his jawline, the narrowing of his eyes into slits of polished steel. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable cadence of authority sharpened over half a century. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his tone deceptively polite, almost grandfatherly. "There are those who believe that matters as grave as judicial reform demand more than conviction. They require seasoned judgment, tempered insight, hard-earned experience." The words floated in the air, coated in a sheen of respect, but weighted with dismissal. He didn't have to say it outright. The accusation was baked into every syllable. "You haven't earned your place here." Rather's hand tapped a slow, methodical beat against the oak table, the sound unnervingly loud in the studio's engineered silence. He smiled thinly, a flash of teeth more chilling than friendly. "Given your relatively brief tenure on the national stage," he pressed on, emphasizing each word like a hammer driving a nail, "how would you answer those critics who wonder whether you truly comprehend the gravity of the systems you wish to reform? Or if perhaps," he paused, letting the insult linger like smoke, "youthful passion has led you dangerously close to naivety." The camera zoomed tighter, catching the flicker, so slight it was almost invisible, of Jasmine's left hand clenching once beneath the desk. Her eyes never wavered from his, dark and unblinking, like a fighter absorbing the first hit without flinching. But the blow was real. In front of millions watching live, Dan Rather hadn't just questioned her proposals. He had questioned her right to even sit at the table. Around them, the vast, gleaming studio felt smaller, hotter, every microphone and camera lens pulling closer, as if America itself leaned in, hungry to see whether the young congresswoman would crumble under the weight of a legend's carefully honed contempt. Rather, sensing the first cut had drawn blood, pressed his advantage like a seasoned warrior who knew that mercy was a weakness and momentum was everything. He shifted slightly in his chair, rolling his shoulders back, settling into the rhythm of an old familiar battle. His voice dipped lower, slower, the kind that demanded you listen not out of fear, but because it wore the armor of history itself. "You know," he began, his tone almost reflective, like he was letting Jasmine in on some private lesson, When I started in this business, truth wasn't just something you said, it was something you lived, something you fought for, something you gave up a lot to protect. His words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, each one chosen like a stone carefully placed on a fragile glass table. I filed stories from jungles, deserts, riots, places where if you got the facts wrong, people didn't just get mad, people died. This wasn't about chasing attention, it was about getting it right. He let that line settle, a silent accusation shimmering between them. Then with a slow breath that seemed to draw in the entire studio's stale, nervous air, he pressed forward. There was a code, he said, tapping two fingers lightly against his chest. An understanding between reporters and the public. You had one job, get it right. Tell the truth, even when it was hard, even when nobody wanted to hear it. His eyes found Jasmine's across the gulf of the studio lights, and for a moment, the years between them seemed to stretch wider than oceans. His gaze was not angry, it was worse, it was disappointed. The look of a man who believed he was witnessing the crumbling of a cathedral he had spent his life building, stone by bloody stone. You see, Congresswoman, he continued, his voice soft but sharp enough to cut, we didn't earn our seats in places like this by shouting louder than everyone else. We earned them by showing, again and again, that we could carry the weight that came with telling the truth. He paused, letting the words settle until the silence itself seemed to accuse her. And sometimes, he added, voice even lower, I wonder if your generation even knows what that weight feels like anymore. His words weren't questions. They were verdicts. And as he finished, Dan rather leaned back ever so slightly, his face set not in triumph, but in sadness, as if the battle in his mind had already been won. Around them, the air was thick with a quiet, biting unfairness. Because what he demanded was not just respect for the craft. He demanded deference to an era that no longer existed, and a burden Jasmine had never been allowed to share. In that cold, merciless light, she was not judged by her ideas or her courage, but by the centuries of tradition she had been born too late to inherit. The weight of his judgment still hung heavy in the air, but Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't even blink, as if she had already prepared her soul for battles exactly like this. The studio lights bore down on her, hot and merciless, but she stayed carved out of steel, untouched. For a long moment, the only movement was Dan Rather himself, shifting slightly, eyes narrowing, searching desperately for a crack in the fortress before him. There was none. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to shout. She didn't need to defend herself. Her silence was the answer. Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't fidget or force a nervous smile. She understood something most people never learn. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. She let the silence expand until it wasn't just uncomfortable. It was unbearable, like a truth everyone knew, but was too afraid to name. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to defend herself like a child called to the principal's office. She let the injustice hang there in front of everyone, raw and exposed, daring them all to see it for what it was. In those seconds, Jasmine seized control of the room without lifting a single finger. And when she finally spoke, her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise in anger. It didn't crack under the weight placed on her shoulders. Instead, it came out low, steady, and razor-sharp, slicing straight through the heavy air. Her eyes locked on Rather's, calm but unyielding, as she said very simply, experience doesn't always mean you were right. The words were clean, clear, and devastating. Not a scream, not a defense, but a fact laid bare on the table between them. And for the first time that night, it was not Jasmine who looked small beneath the lights. It was the weight of the old world, sagging under the truth she had just spoken aloud. Rather, stung by her calm defiance, didn't retreat. Instead, he doubled down, sharpening his words into weapons meant to cut deeper where silence had failed. Dan Rather leaned slightly forward again, his hands clasped tightly on the table, his voice losing its grandfatherly warmth and gaining the sharper edge of a prosecutor sensing an opportunity. We live in a time, he said, slow and heavy, where outrage travels faster than facts, where being loud is often mistaken for being right. He let the words hang for just a beat, then drove them harder. We've seen it. Networks that once stood for truth now chasing ratings. Stories rushed out without verification. Headlines designed to provoke, not to inform. His tone wasn't angry. It was weary, full of the righteous exhaustion of someone who believed he had watched the house he built burn down, one careless match at a time. "You are part of a generation," he continued, his gaze drilling into Jasmine with almost clinical precision, "that sometimes mistakes noise for knowledge, volume for value, passion for principle." Every word was chosen to sting, to paint her not as a serious reformer, but as another product of a culture he despised. The injustice of it crackled in the air, because the attack wasn't on her ideas. It was on her very right to speak them at all. And as the cameras inched even closer, the audience could almost feel it. Rather wasn't just arguing anymore. He was trying to bury her. Seeing the blow had landed, or at least unsettled the ground beneath her, Rather pressed once more, aiming not just at Jasmine, but at the entire world he believed had cheapened the meaning of truth. He straightened in his chair, slow and deliberate, smoothing a hand across his tie in a gesture that was more ritual than necessity. His voice dropped slightly, almost conspiratorial, as if he were sharing an uncomfortable truth with an old friend who had lost their way. "We live in the TikTok era now," Rather said. Every word weighted, every syllable a small stone thrown at glass, where 15 seconds of outrage earns more attention than 15 years of real work. He paused, not because he needed the breath, but because he wanted the silence to frame the insult perfectly, like a dagger displayed in a velvet case. His smile was thin, stretched tight across a face built from decades of disappointment, and it didn't reach his eyes. Headlines have become hashtags. Stories have been replaced with slogans. Noise has been mistaken for knowledge. Each word fell heavy, one after another, like the slow, certain swing of a hammer meant to drive a nail deep and permanent. "But truth," he said, tapping the table once with his knuckles, sharp and loud, "truth doesn't come in sound bites. Truth doesn't trend. And truth," he added, locking his gaze onto Jasmine's without blinking, "doesn't beg for attention." For a split second, it felt like the tide might turn, that maybe, just maybe, the world would choose the comfort of an old myth over the hard edge of a new truth. He didn't call her name. He didn't need to. The accusation was clear enough. "You are what's wrong with the new world." Around them, the studio was so silent, it was almost painful. No shuffling papers, no coughs from the crew, no whispered directions from the producer's booth. It was as if the whole building was holding its breath, terrified that even the smallest sound would tip the balance and cause the whole moment to explode. For one heartbeat, for one terrible second, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just facing Dan Rather. She was facing every doubt, every old voice that had ever whispered she didn't belong, and millions of strangers were watching to see what she would do next. For a moment, it looked as if Jasmine might break under the weight of it, but then, with a calmness so sharp it almost seemed cruel, she did something no one expected. She smiled. It wasn't a smirk. It wasn't defiant or flashy. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. A small, slow curl at the corner of her mouth that spoke of something old and heavy inside her, something forged from too many moments just like this one. She let the smile live in the silence, stretching the seconds until the air between them felt brittle, ready to snap. The cameras caught it. The millions watching at home saw it too. In that simple, almost imperceptible smile, Jasmine Crockett did what words could never fully do. She took the power back without moving a muscle. Then, without changing the steady rhythm of her breathing, she spoke. Her voice was low, even, unhurried. The kind of voice that forced you to lean in, to really listen, because it wasn't fighting for your attention. It already owned it. "It's true," she said, her tone respectful, but edged with something colder, sharper. "Truth doesn't trend. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't need a spotlight to exist." She let those words sink deep into the room, her eyes locked on Rather's, not in anger but in certainty, as if she were stating the weather, not picking a fight. Then she tilted her head just slightly, almost curiously, and her voice softened even more, which somehow made what came next hit twice as hard. But sometimes, she continued, pausing just long enough for the anticipation to bite, even the people who spent their lives chasing truth forgot how to carry it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She let the accusation float there, naked and undeniable, in the hot, humming air of the studio. She watched him feel it, watched it land. And then, in a voice that was barely louder than a whisper but somehow filled the entire room, she said 5 words that cracked the floor beneath them both. "America still remembers Rathergate, sir." The name alone, Rathergate, ripped open old wounds that neither time nor pride had fully healed, and Jasmine, without raising her voice, pulled the curtain all the way back. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She spoke slowly, with the kind of steady, cutting calm that forced every ear in the room to listen. "Rathergate wasn't just a scandal," Jasmine said, her gaze locked unblinking on Dan Rather. "It was a betrayal. In 2004, you stood in front of millions of Americans and delivered a story that wasn't true, claiming President George W. Bush had dodged military service based on documents that turned out to be fake." She let that sink in for a moment, then went on, her voice even lower, more direct. "It wasn't a small mistake. It was a massive breach of trust. And you weren't just any reporter. You were the face of American news, the man people counted on to tell them what was real." She leaned in just slightly, as if pulling him closer into the undeniable weight of the truth. "When that story fell apart, it wasn't just your reputation that took the hit. It was the faith of an entire country in the press itself." Her words slowed further, everyone hitting like a hammer driving a nail. For years after that, Americans didn't look at the news and see guardians of truth anymore. They saw men who could be fooled, or worse, men who could fool them. She let a final breath of silence fill the studio before finishing, soft but merciless. "You became the living proof of how easily trust could be broken." The silence after her words was heavier than anything spoken. But Jasmine wasn't finished, and what she said next shattered the last illusions hanging in the air. She sat a little straighter, the quiet confidence radiating off her like heat from a flame that refused to die. Her voice didn't rise, but somehow it filled every inch of the room. "It wasn't my generation that weakened the truth," Jasmine said, each word deliberate, each syllable slicing clean through the heavy air. She paused just long enough to make sure everyone heard it, felt it, lived it. "It was yours," she continued, her eyes never leaving Rather's, "that let it bleed." The words didn't explode. They detonated slowly, sinking into the walls, the cameras, the very breath of the room. For a long heartbeat, there was nothing but a stunned, frozen stillness, like the air itself was too afraid to move. And then it hit. A low, rolling sound at first, gasps, sharp intakes of breath, a rumble of voices that grew and grew until it felt like the walls themselves might crack. Some of the crew shifted awkwardly behind the cameras. A producer in the control room was seen standing up, hands pressed against his headset, shouting silent commands that no one could hear over the growing chaos. The audience was no better, some stunned into wide-eyed silence, others whispering fiercely, a few even clapping before stopping themselves, as if they too were unsure whether they had just witnessed courage or sacrilege. It wasn't just disruption. It was the sound of a boundary breaking, a truth finally spoken aloud in a room built to pretend it didn't exist. The moderator, face pale and stiff, scrambled to regain control, his voice cutting sharply through the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, let's maintain order," he barked, tapping his papers against the desk like a gavel in a courtroom that no longer believed in rules. But the spell of ceremony was broken. Jasmine's words still hung there, alive and defiant, refusing to be smothered. Across the country, millions sat frozen in front of their screens, knowing without a shadow of a doubt that they had just seen the moment when everything changed, and there was no going back. As the noise finally ebbed, a deeper silence took its place, one not of respect, but of expectation, and all eyes turned back to Dan Rather, waiting to see if the legend could withstand the weight of his own past. For a moment he stayed still, as if the force of Jasmine's words had physically pressed him into the leather of his chair. Then he moved too fast, too tight, A small adjustment of his tie, a clearing of his throat that echoed louder than intended. The cracks were small but unmistakable, and in a room trained to notice weakness, they were deafening. His voice, when it came, lacked its usual iron. It was, it was a professional lapse, he said, his words stumbling out in fits. Too polished, yet too desperate, like a man trying to read a prepared statement from a script that no longer made sense. It wasn't intentional. It was an error in judgment, nothing more. But no matter how carefully he spoke, the room had already changed. His excuses, once enough to command understanding or pity, now fell flat, hitting the floor like broken glass no one bothered to sweep up. The energy in the studio shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. The unspoken contract between legend and audience, the quiet agreement to forgive his age, his mistakes, his humanity, had dissolved into something colder, harder. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment, sharp and final. A collective sense that the man before them was no longer untouchable, that even the mighty could falter when forced to face their own reflection. The cameras caught it all. The way Dan Rather's shoulders sagged just slightly, the way he blinked too often, the way his gaze dropped for half a heartbeat before snapping back up in a weak attempt at defiance. And then they shifted, slow and deliberate, toward Jasmine Crockett. She didn't move. She didn't react. She sat there like a still flame, burning quietly, refusing to flicker. Her face was unreadable, her hands steady in her lap, her body language saying without a single word, "I didn't have to destroy you. You did it yourself." And across the country, across the television screens and glowing devices of millions, people saw it happen in real time. The passing of a moment, the collapse of an illusion, the rising of a new force that didn't need to shout to be heard. And in the heavy waiting silence that followed, Jasmine didn't gloat, didn't rush. She simply rose into the space left open before her, carrying the weight of 1,000 unsaid truths. She sat perfectly still for a heartbeat longer, letting the moment thicken until it felt almost unbearable. The lights above her were hot and harsh, the cameras hovered like silent judges, and the millions watching at home leaned closer to their screens, barely breathing. But Jasmine was steady, grounded, untouched by the chaos she had stirred. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was low and clear, not loud, not trembling, but filled with a force that made every syllable land like a fist against a locked door. "The truth," she said, each word sharp enough to draw blood, "doesn't need permission." She paused, letting the sentence hang in the air, daring anyone to challenge it. Her gaze didn't flicker to the moderator, to the audience, or even to Dan Rather. She stayed rooted, unwavering, speaking as if she were carving the words directly into the stone walls around her. "It just needs to be spoken," she added, her voice dropping slightly lower, almost intimate now, so calm it became undeniable. The tension was so thick it was almost physical. People in the studio visibly stiffened, feeling the ground shifting beneath them, but powerless to stop it. Slowly, purposefully, Jasmine turned toward the nearest camera, the red light glowing like a living eye, and locked eyes with the nation. She didn't blink. She didn't soften. She held the lens the way a soldier holds a battle line. "And if the truth makes someone uncomfortable," she said, her tone even sharper now, slicing clean through the brittle silence, "maybe they should ask themselves why." She didn't smile after she spoke. She didn't look away. She simply let the words sit there, burning hotter with every second of silence that followed. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't arrogance. It was something rarer, something harder. It was the certainty of a person who knew that speaking the truth, especially when it hurt, wasn't just a right. It was a duty. As Jasmine's final words echoed into the silence, the cameras stayed frozen on her face. But outside that studio, the real storm had already begun. It started as a spark, a single tweet, a clipped video, no longer than 15 seconds. But in seconds, it was everywhere. Within the first minute, hashtags like Crockett and Rather, Truth Without Permission, and the New Voice of America began climbing the trending charts with a speed that made even seasoned media veterans blink in disbelief. On Twitter, the clip of Jasmine looking straight into the camera and speaking her final line detonated like a bomb. People didn't just share it, They reacted to it as if they had been waiting years, decades, for someone to finally say what she had said. Accounts that usually argued across political lines, progressive activists, military veterans, even disillusioned former journalists, found themselves retweeting the same moment, adding captions like, "This is not a soundbite. This is history." Some framed her words in bold black text over the American flag. Others slowed the footage down, adding orchestral music behind her calm, devastating delivery, turning it into something almost mythic, almost larger than life. In less than 5 minutes, the video had been shared over 100,000 times. In less than 10, it had crossed 1 million. News outlets scrambled to catch up. MSNBC broke into programming with a live panel, the anchor wide-eyed as she replayed the footage. This is one of those rare moments," she said, almost whispering, as if afraid to break the gravity of what had just unfolded. Over at Fox News, the mood was more combative. Clips of Jasmine's line were framed between banners screaming, "Disrespecting journalistic legends," and "A new low" or "A necessary truth." But even their host couldn't deny the impact. One grizzled commentator, trying and failing to hide the grudging respect in his voice, muttered on live air, "Well, she didn't miss. That's for damn sure." On TikTok, a different kind of storm exploded. Thousands of young creators, many of whom had never stayed tuned to a congressional hearing or a primetime political show in their lives, seized the clip and made it their own. Some added pounding hip-hop beats behind Jasmine's final stare into the camera. Others stitched her words into videos of protest marches, courtroom dramas, slow-motion shots of broken glass reforming. "She spoke for all of us," one caption read. "The ones who were told to wait their turn. The ones who were told to shut up and let the old world keep bleeding." Within 30 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had gone from respected congresswoman to full-blown cultural symbol. CNN flashed breaking banners. "Crockett calls out, rather a new era of accountability." The New York Times, notoriously slow to react to viral moments, posted an early digital headline before the hour closed. "Truth doesn't need permission. How Jasmine Crockett redrew the lines of political discourse." Within an hour, Rolling Stone had already called it the Jasmine Crockett moment. But the most telling sign wasn't just in headlines or trending charts. It was in the faces of those old enough to know what it meant. Journalists who had spent their lives defending a broken system now sat in newsrooms, staring at muted televisions, their faces pale, their hands motionless on keyboards. They understood before anyone else that something bigger than a scandal or a viral moment had happened. They understood that Jasmine hadn't just won an argument. She had pulled the curtain back on decades of quiet compromises, unspoken bargains, and comfortable lies. And she had done it without raising her voice. In Washington, D.C., power brokers scrambled to measure the damage. Staffers in the Capitol building forwarded clips of the moment to chiefs of staff, to political consultants, to major donors with subject lines like urgent. "You need to see this." Some saw opportunity, others saw a threat, but no one, not even the bitterest cynics, dared call it a mistake. Meanwhile, on Reddit, a flood of memes was already underway. Someone posted a split screen. On one side, a black and white photo of Dan Rather in his prime, microphone in hand, standing firm during Hurricane Carla. On the other side, a color photo of Jasmine, sitting calm and unyielding under the studio lights, staring into the camera with the world on fire behind her. Caption, "The old storm, the new storm." Other memes were crueler, painting Rather as the fading emperor, the man who demanded loyalty from a system he himself had helped break. But amid the jokes and the celebration, there was something deeper, something electric, an overwhelming sense that something had shifted, not just in that studio, but in the country itself. And yet, through all of it, Jasmine Crockett said nothing more. She didn't tweet. She didn't post a statement. She didn't launch a campaign fundraiser. She let the truth she had spoken live on its own, without the desperate need to spin it, to package it, to make it palatable. In a world obsessed with rebranding moments into marketing slogans, her silence was deafening, and it made her victory even louder. Back inside the studio, the moderators and producers tried to regain control of the program. They tried to move on, to pivot to safer ground, to recapture the scripted flow of the night. But it was useless. The energy had shifted. The room itself felt heavier, thicker, like the walls were bearing witness to something they weren't built to contain. And at the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, calm as a storm waiting for the next wave to come. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't demanded the spotlight. She hadn't asked for permission. She had simply told the truth, and the world had no choice now but to reckon with it. Across America, from crowded bars to quiet living rooms, people stared at their screens, silent, blinking, feeling something they couldn't quite name settle heavy in their chests. It wasn't outrage. It wasn't inspiration. It was something rarer, something raw. The realization that sometimes real change doesn't arrive with a roar. Sometimes it comes in the form of a woman sitting quietly under hot lights, daring to tell the truth no one else would. And once heard, it could not be unheard. Once seen, it could not be unseen. The fire had been lit, and it wasn't going out anytime soon. But as the footage burned its way across every screen in America, something deeper began to break open. Not just outrage or admiration, but a full-scale war over what Jasmine's moment really meant. Within hours, the battle lines had been drawn, not with guns or banners, but with opinion pieces, cable news panels, and furious threads across every corner of the internet. On one side stood the old guard, the traditionalists, the veterans of journalism and politics who had built their careers on the rules Jasmine had so effortlessly shattered. They took to the airwaves, their voices thick with outrage masked as concern. "What she did was reckless," barked one former editor-in-chief on a primetime panel, his fist clenching on the table. "She humiliated a man who spent his life defending the truth." Another commentator shook his head solemnly, as if grieving a lost era. "There's a reason we respect our institutions, even when they falter," he said. "Without that respect, we have nothing but chaos." These voices, powerful and polished, called for civility, for caution, for a return to orderly discourse. They didn't deny that Dan Rather had made mistakes. They couldn't, but they insisted that calling him out, especially so publicly, especially so sharply, was an act of disrespect that would tear at the fragile threads still holding the country together. "It's not just about what she said," one panelist argued. "It's how she said it. The tone, the aggression, the lack of deference to experience." The word deference hung heavily in the air, and across the internet, millions knew exactly what it meant. Know your place. But on the other side, a new chorus rose up, louder, younger, hungrier. Reformers, activists, everyday citizens who had long felt invisible under the weight of tradition seized the moment with both hands. "Finally," tweeted a young journalist from Detroit, "finally someone said it. Experience without accountability is just arrogance." Viral TikTok stitched Jasmine's calm stare with images of marches, courtrooms, broken chains. On podcasts and YouTube live streams, new voices rose to drown out the old. Voices saying what had simmered for years in the corners of the American dream. That maybe it was time for the old kings and queens of truth to answer for the crowns they had bent and tarnished. They called Jasmine fearless. They called her necessary. "She didn't break the rules," one op-ed in the Washington Post thundered. "She exposed that the rules were already broken and had been for a very long time." In panel discussions across MSNBC, in editorials in The Atlantic, in late-night monologues that usually danced around politics but now couldn't help but dive headfirst, a new narrative took shape. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just survived the night. She had redefined it. Still, the clash between the two camps wasn't clean. It wasn't neat. It was ugly, brutal, fought not just over facts, but over the soul of what America thought it was. Supporters of the old order posted grainy footage of Dan Rather reporting from war zones, standing in hurricane winds, anchoring elections through chaos, pleading for the country to remember his service. Reformers responded with clips of Rathergate, screenshots of discredited headlines, reminders that no amount of history could excuse the betrayal of trust. Cable news channels ran split screens. On one side, Jasmine's steely gaze. On the other, Dan Rather's grim, blinking face at the moment she delivered her blow. Analysts dissected every word, every breath, every micro-expression, as if trying to rewrite the meaning of what had already been burned into the public's memory. And in the comments sections, on call-in radio shows, at family dinner tables and late-night bars, the debate crackled like wildfire. Some argued that Jasmine was a symbol of the new arrogance, too quick to tear down, too proud to learn. Others said she was exactly what the moment demanded, a voice unafraid to speak the truth even when it made the room uncomfortable, even when it shattered the myth of infallibility that had kept so many systems unchallenged for so long. Memes flooded Facebook and Instagram. One showed a crumbling stone statue of a news anchor, shattered by a single tiny hammer labeled truth. Another showed Jasmine standing tall while old giants fell behind her, their armor rusted through from the inside. Even in political circles, the aftershocks were immediate. In private emails leaked to the press, Democratic strategists debated whether Jasmine's rise was a gift or a grenade. "She's electric," one advisor wrote, "but she scares the hell out of the donor class." Republican operatives circulated talking points labeling her divisive, disrespectful, dangerously radical, but some among them whispered a different fear. What if she was simply telling a truth they could no longer afford to deny? The country didn't know which side it was on yet. Maybe it never would. Maybe that was the point. But everywhere the air was charged with something rare and volatile, the feeling that a real choice was being forced into the light. In the days that followed, editorials battled each other on the front pages of America's biggest newspapers. One columnist declared Jasmine Crockett the harbinger of a cultural collapse. Another declared her the voice America's been waiting for. Talk radio exploded with furious debates. At churches and union halls and college campuses, conversations turned fiery and raw, dividing friends, families, generations. And all across it, Jasmine said nothing. She issued no follow-up statement. She did no victory lap. She didn't need to. The battle wasn't about her anymore. It was about the fault line she had revealed, the deep, jagged wound that had been there all along, just waiting for someone brave enough to point at it and say, "This is real. Now what are you going to do about it?" Across the country, old powers scrambled to reinforce their walls. New forces gathered outside those walls, stronger with every passing hour. It wasn't a polite argument. It wasn't a debate for television ratings. It was the sound of a country, cornered by its own history, trying to decide what parts of itself were still worth saving. And in the eye of that growing storm, Jasmine Crockett's words still echoed. The truth doesn't need permission. It just needs to be spoken. And once spoken, it could never be unsaid. And just when the fury seemed ready to swallow itself whole, a single unexpected voice rose above the noise, one the nation thought would never speak again. 1 week to the day after Jasmine Crockett's quiet earthquake, when the country was still raw and gasping from the aftershocks, an op-ed appeared on the Atlantic's front page. It didn't come with a press conference. It wasn't teased with dramatic headlines. It simply arrived, stark, simple, almost solemn, signed by Dan Rather himself. The title alone froze the news cycle. When the truth hurts, listen anyway. The piece didn't open with excuses. It didn't try to rewrite what had happened under the studio lights. Instead, Dan Rather wrote plainly, almost painfully, his words carrying the heavy ache of someone who had been forced to see himself without the soft filters of memory or pride. "Last week," he began, "I faced something that every person who ever called themselves a journalist should be willing to face. The truth, even when it cuts deep." He didn't name Jasmine in the first line, or the second. He didn't have to. Her presence hung over every word, every comma, like a silent witness to the reckoning. Rather described the moment without embellishment, the tension in the room, the silence after her words, the way the truth had pressed against him like a weight he could no longer ignore. And then, with a brutal honesty that few had expected him capable of, he wrote the sentence that would set the world alight once more. Jasmine Crockett gave me a painful but necessary lesson. The admission hit the political world like another shockwave, not because it was loud, but because it was unguarded. Rather didn't try to minimize her. He didn't belittle her youth, her generation, or her delivery. Instead, he did the one thing that no one had done all week. He listened. He described how he had spent decades believing that experience automatically made him right, that the passage of time itself justified his judgment. He spoke about the danger of mistaking tradition for truth and how hard it was, even now, to admit that sometimes the oldest voices need to be challenged by the youngest ones. Halfway through the piece, Dan Rather finally named her Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and with it, the tone shifted from confession to something almost reverent. "We need more leaders like her," he wrote, "leaders who do not fear the truth, no matter how inconvenient it may be." His words, steady and precise, carried none of the defensiveness that had clouded his voice on that stage. Instead, they bore the clarity of a man who had finally, painfully, remembered what the real work of truth-telling demanded. He closed the piece not by defending his legacy, but by surrendering it to something bigger than himself. "The truth," he wrote, "does not belong to the old or the young. It belongs to the brave." The reaction was immediate, and unlike anything the country had seen in decades. Newsrooms that had spent the last week battling over whether Jasmine's challenge was a mistake or a revolution now found themselves stunned into silence. Cable news anchors fumbled for words, trying to reframe narratives that had calcified too quickly. Pundits who had scorned Jasmine now scrambled to walk their outrage back, their faces tight with the sour taste of being caught on the wrong side of history. On social media, the clip of Rather's confession was posted side by side with Jasmine's original takedown. TikTok creators stitched his words over footage of her sitting calmly under the studio lights, making the moment feel inevitable, as if the old world had been destined to bow to the new from the start. Hashtags like "Rather listens" and "Truth belongs to the brave" soared to the top of Twitter. Young activists wrote open letters thanking Rather not for agreeing with them, but for demonstrating that humility was still possible in an age drowning in pride. Even late-night comedians, who had feasted all week on the Rather vs. Crockett clash, paused to offer a rare note of respect. "You know," one said, shaking his head in mock amazement, "it's not often you see a giant fall, and then get back up just to say, 'You were right.' That's a plot twist I didn't see coming." But not everyone cheered. Among the old guard, there were grumbles, whispered accusations that Rather had been bullied, that he had betrayed his own generation by admitting fault. Some editorials quietly urged maturity and perspective, warning against a future where experience was discarded at the first sign of discomfort. Yet even these voices seemed smaller now, more desperate. The tide had turned too visibly, too powerfully, and at the center of it, Jasmine Crockett still said nothing. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't claim victory. She didn't ride the wave of validation with triumphant speeches. She simply kept doing her work day after day, letting the truth she had spoken, and the truth Dan Rather had finally acknowledged, do what truth always does when it is allowed to breathe: change everything it touches. In Washington, the shift was more than symbolic. Younger lawmakers, inspired by her example, grew bolder in committee rooms and hearings. Questions once swallowed out of politeness were now spoken plainly. Assumptions about who deserved automatic respect and who needed to earn it began to crumble. Staffers, long used to advising their bosses to play it safe, whispered among themselves about a new kind of politics rising from the ashes of the old. And across the country, people who had felt invisible for too long carried Jasmine's words with them like a small, secret flame. They repeated them quietly at kitchen tables, in classrooms, at protest marches. The truth doesn't need permission. It just needs to be spoken. Dan Rather's admission had not erased his mistakes. It hadn't wiped the slate clean, but it had done something almost more powerful. It had proven that even the oldest institutions could still choose humility over hubris. That courage wasn't the exclusive property of the young or the old, but belonged to anyone willing to face the brutal, necessary mirror of truth. And for the first time in a long, long time, America dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, something better was possible after all. The headlines were still burning hot across every television screen. The hashtags were still climbing, the clips still spinning through 1,000 apps, 1,000 edits, 1,000 loud, relentless conversations. But here in the marble corridors of the Capitol, none of that noise followed Jasmine Crockett. Here there was only silence. Her footsteps echoed sharply against the polished floor as she made her way down the long hallway, the sound oddly hollow in the grand, empty space. Security guards posted near the elevators nodded at her without a word. Staffers emerging from late-night meetings lowered their gazes, whispering after she passed, unsure whether to offer congratulations or apologies. Jasmine didn't stop. She didn't even glance at them. She just kept walking, the weight of the night pressing heavier on her shoulders with every step. When she reached the south wing, a part of the building nearly abandoned at this hour, she paused. A tall window framed the city outside, Washington, D.C., glittering under the bruised velvet of midnight skies. Streetlights flickered far below. Red and blue police strobes splashed against the pale stone of government buildings. And beyond them, hidden in the dark, the American people wrestled with the tremors she had sent through the ground. For a long moment, Jasmine just stood there. No cameras, no crowds, no flashing lights. Just her and the silence she had earned. Victory, she thought, didn't feel the way people imagined it would. It didn't come with music swelling under your feet. It didn't taste like champagne or smell like roses. It felt heavy. It felt raw. It felt like standing alone in the ruins of a house that everyone else had insisted wasn't burning. She leaned her forehead gently against the cool glass, closing her eyes. All week they had called her brave. All week they had posted memes, written op-eds, shouted her name in celebration or in fury. But none of those voices were here now. None of them could carry the cost she carried inside her ribcage. Speaking the truth wasn't the hard part. Living with what it destroyed, that was where the real weight lived. Her phone buzzed for the 100th time in her pocket. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She knew what was waiting: invitations to interviews, offers to write a book, urgent requests for her to headline rallies, fundraisers, causes she hadn't even heard of yet, opportunities. The vultures always came when the blood was fresh. But Jasmine wasn't interested in building a brand. She wasn't interested in becoming a symbol carefully managed and sold in pieces to a hungry public. She had spoken because she couldn't bear the silence anymore, and she knew deep in the marrow of her bones that the silence would always come back. It was part of the cycle: noise, applause, outrage, and then nothing. She opened her eyes and stared down at the city again. How many others had stood in this place before her? How many had spoken the truth and watched the world roar in approval, only to find themselves abandoned when the next shiny controversy rolled across the headlines? She thought of Martin. She thought of Malcolm. She thought of every woman and man who had stood up when it was easier to kneel and paid the price in loneliness, not fame. You don't speak the truth because it's popular. You speak it because it's true. Jasmine straightened from the window and took a slow breath. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving her muscles aching, her mind heavy. She hadn't slept properly in days. She hadn't eaten much either. But she wasn't tired the way most people understood it. She was tired the way soldiers are tired after a battle they know is only the first of many. Her hand drifted toward the thin gold cross resting against her collarbone, a gift from her grandmother, given on a porch swing in the sweltering heat of a Texas summer. "This is your armor," her grandmother had said, fastening the chain with gnarled fingers. "Not because it will protect you, but because it will remind you who you are when the world tries to tell you otherwise." Jasmine smiled faintly at the memory, then let her hand fall. She didn't need armor tonight. Tonight she needed to remember why she had walked into the fire in the first place. Not for claps, not for votes, not even for history. She had spoken because she had to. Because if the truth had no place left in the halls of power, then it had no place left anywhere. And if speaking it meant standing alone, then so be it. She turned away from the window and walked slowly back down the corridor, her heels clicking steadily against the marble. Each step measured, deliberate, carrying the quiet gravity of someone who understood that the cost of doing the right thing wasn't temporary. It was a lifetime. As she passed an empty conference room, she caught a glimpse of herself in the dark glass. For a moment, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. Not because she looked broken, but because she looked changed. Sharper, stronger, a little sadder. She paused, studying her own reflection. What they wouldn't understand, the panelists, the pundits, the trolls clicking furiously on their keyboards, was that this wasn't a game to her. It never had been. This wasn't about scoring points or delivering viral moments. It was about living in a way that would let her sleep at night. It was about standing straight in a world that bent itself to convenience. The words rang back in her mind, clean and fierce and unrepentant. No, she thought, it never has. The hallway stretched before her, endless and empty. The work ahead would be brutal. The blowback would come, sharper, uglier, more dangerous than anything the first wave had thrown. And she would face it alone, again and again. But Jasmine Crockett had already made her peace with that. She didn't need the crowd. She didn't need the applause. She didn't need the permission of a world too afraid to look itself in the eye. She had her voice. She had her truth. And no matter what storm came next, she would walk into it, steady and unbowed, one slow, quiet step at a time. While Jasmine Crockett walked the silent halls of power alone, the country she had challenged was not silent. It was alive. It was burning. Across every city, every suburb, every corner of America, where politics had once been a quiet background noise, battle lines were being drawn, not by party, not by race, not even by age, but by something far more volatile. The question of who still had the right to speak the truth and who had long ago forfeited it. In newsrooms, journalists gathered in tense, whispered meetings, their coffee cups forgotten on scratched wooden tables as they argued over what Jasmine's moment meant. Some leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, scowling. "You don't call out legends like that," they said. "You respect the people who came before you, even if they stumbled." Others, younger, sharper-eyed, leaned forward, their voices cutting sharper. When respect becomes silence, it stops being noble. It becomes complicity. At universities, debate halls overflowed with students arguing fiercely, sometimes at the edge of shoving matches. Professors used to coaxing polite discussions from weary classrooms found themselves refereeing battles they had no control over. Was Jasmine Crockett a necessary shock to a dying system, or an arrogant symptom of a generation too quick to tear down what they barely understood? No one agreed. No one was neutral. And for the first time in years, no one wanted to be. In corporate offices, CEOs and brand strategists huddled around crisis boards, whispering in urgent tones. The old playbook of staying quiet, staying safe, suddenly felt useless. The new energy Jasmine had unleashed wasn't polite, it wasn't predictable, and it wasn't going away. Political consultants on both sides scrambled to adapt. Democrats whispered about rebranding the party around authenticity. More Crockett, less polished speeches. One memo read. Republicans debated furiously behind closed doors. Should they attack her as a radical, or quietly try to siphon off her message of accountability for their own causes? Cable news hosts, once so confident in their roles as referees of public opinion, now struggled to keep up. Every night their panels grew louder, angrier, more chaotic. Every night Jasmine's face appeared again, sometimes praised, sometimes vilified, but always there, unignorable, an immovable center of gravity around which the old world spun itself dizzy trying to catch up. And the people, the ones who didn't have blue check marks next to their names, the ones who didn't host shows or write columns, felt the shift most deeply of all. They didn't always have the right words for it. They didn't always agree on every detail. But in bars, in beauty salons, in church basements and bus stops, a single feeling pulsed stronger with every conversation. Something had cracked. And no matter what came next, it wasn't going to be the same. Some felt hope, wild, fragile, electric. Some felt rage, raw and desperate, fighting to pull the old structures back into place before it was too late. But no one felt nothing. The old elite fought to reassert control. Editorials poured in like floodwater, carefully crafted essays from retired politicians, aging journalists, establishment voices urging caution, respect, moderation. We must not destroy our institutions out of impatience, they warned. Reform is good. Revolution is dangerous. But for every polished plea for patience, There were 1,000 raw, furious responses from people who had waited their entire lives for someone to tell the truth without asking permission. They posted Jasmine's words in bold black letters across their timelines, across posters, across protest signs taped to the sides of buildings. The truth doesn't need permission, it just needs to be spoken. The movement wasn't organized, it wasn't funded, it wasn't planned by political consultants in glass towers. It was spontaneous, it was messy, and it was real. In the churches of Montgomery, Alabama, pastors wove Jasmine's stand into sermons about justice and courage. In coffee shops in Portland, artists painted murals of her, capturing her calm, unflinching gaze under storm-gray skies. In high school civics classes across Texas and Ohio and Georgia, teachers, some openly, some carefully, used clips of her confrontation as case studies in what civic courage could look like. Not everyone agreed with her. Not everyone liked her. But even those who hated what she stood for could not deny the shift she had forced. This was no longer just about one congresswoman facing down one legendary journalist. This was about America itself, about whether a nation built on the idea of truth could survive confronting the places where it had betrayed that idea. The divisions hardened quickly. On one side stood the guardians of tradition, those who insisted that experience, even when tarnished, must still be deferred to. On the other side stood the breakers of silence, those who believed that respect earned without accountability was no respect at all. It was not a clean war. Families fractured over it. Church congregations argued bitterly. City councils split down invisible, bitter lines. But underneath the noise, underneath the shouting, something colder and more permanent had begun to crystallize. The country was no longer debating whether truth mattered. It was debating whether comfort mattered more. And in that fight, Jasmine Crockett's moment lived on, not as a clip, not as a meme, but as a battle standard waving high above the noise, stubborn and unbreakable. Inside the Capitol, some of the old guard muttered that the storm would pass, that the country would forget, that people always forget. But outside the marble walls in streets and schools and bedrooms, lit by the cold glow of cell phone screens at 2 in the morning, the fire refused to die. Because Jasmine's real victory wasn't in the trending charts, it wasn't in the polls, it wasn't even in Dan Rather's reluctant admission. It was in the millions who, for the first time, realized they didn't need permission to speak the truth. And once awakened, that kind of power does not sleep again easily. But long after the headlines faded, long after the debates cooled, and the next scandal tried to steal the spotlight, something deeper remained, an unshakable lesson written in the quiet spaces between Jasmine Crockett's words. The true battle had never been about who won a single night under the hot lights of a television studio. It wasn't about trending hashtags or viral videos, or even the temporary shifting of public opinion. It was about something far older, far more dangerous, the idea that truth was not a luxury for the comfortable, but a weapon for the brave. Jasmine Crockett's stand reminded the world of something it had long tried to forget, that telling the truth will not make you popular. It will not shield you from attack. It will not guarantee applause or forgiveness or peace. Often it will do the opposite. It will cost you friendships. It will cost you safety. It will cost you comfort, and still it must be spoken. The human heart craves safety, craves belonging, craves the warmth of the tribe. But justice does not live in comfort. Progress does not bloom in polite silence. Truth does not survive when it is left to rot behind closed doors. It demands light. It demands risk. It demands people willing to carry its unbearable weight even when the crowd turns its back and walks away. In every era, it is easier to side with tradition, with experience, with the soothing reassurance of voices that say, "Trust me, I know better." And it is far harder, far lonelier, to sit in a room full of towering reputations and say, with steady hands and steady heart, "Experience without accountability is not wisdom, it is rot." The lesson wasn't about Dan Rather's legacy. It wasn't even about Jasmine Crockett's rise. It was about the price of truth and the rare, brutal kind of courage it takes to pay it. Because real courage doesn't look like grand speeches or sweeping applause. It looks like standing alone in the blistering light, knowing you will be misunderstood, knowing you will be attacked, knowing you will be left carrying the silence when everyone else has gone home, and doing it anyway. It is easy to tell the truth when it costs nothing. It is easy to be brave when you are certain the world will cheer for you afterward. But what Jasmine showed the world, the lesson carved into the marrow of her moment, was that the kind of truth that matters, the kind of truth that changes the world, almost always comes wrapped in discomfort, in sacrifice, in pain. It demands that you speak even when your voice shakes. It demands that you stand even when your legs are tired. It demands that you refuse to flinch even when the full weight of tradition, of power, of history itself leans against your chest, daring you to stay silent. And when you do, when you choose truth over comfort, when you choose to speak even when you are scared, you don't just change the conversation, you change the possible. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defeat an argument. She cracked open the walls that had kept too many silent for too long. She showed a country drunk on nostalgia that there is no future worth building on the bones of lies. She reminded a weary generation that change does not come with permission slips. It comes with pain, and it is worth it. So if there is a lesson to carry forward, it is this. Do not wait for the world to be ready for your truth. Do not wait for permission. Do not wait for comfort or consensus or the perfect moment. Speak when it matters, especially when it costs you something to do so. Because if enough people are brave enough to speak when silence feels safest, the world cannot help but shift under their feet. Jasmine Crockett stood in a room built to make her shrink, and she grew instead. She stood under lights meant to expose her weaknesses and showed them her strength. She spoke the truth not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And in doing so, she left behind a blueprint for every soul who has ever stood trembling before a system that said, "Sit down, stay quiet, wait your turn." Her answer, the answer that burned itself into the heart of America, was clear. The truth doesn't need permission. It just needs to be spoken. And that truth, once spoken, can never be undone. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In one unforgettable night, Sandra Bullock and Jasmine Crockett shattered the silence and exposed the brutal cost of surviving injustice in America. Under the harsh lights of New York City, two fires collided, one born from the relentless fight for justice, the other forged by years of resilience against a world designed to erase them. What they revealed wasn't just survival, it was a blueprint for a revolution of hope, built from scars, sacrifice, and the refusal to be silent. What did they say, and what did they do? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Grand Hall of the Lincoln Center in New York City hummed with a strange electric stillness. Every seat was filled, yet no one moved. The overhead lights dimmed to a dusky gold, casting long shadows across the marble floor like memories too heavy to erase. Behind the stage, a giant banner unfurled silently. Voices of resilience. The audience leaned forward as the host stepped into a single beam of light, her voice slicing cleanly through the heavy air. Tonight, she began, two women will share not just their victories, but their scars, because it's our scars that light the way. The music, soft and haunting, rose from the hidden orchestra pit, its slow notes curling through the room like smoke from an unseen fire. Spotlights sharpened, carving two empty chairs on stage into stark, waiting shapes. Outside these walls, the world still played its games of indifference and division. But inside this hall, something different was about to happen. Something raw, something real, something that would not ask for permission to be heard. The host let the silence stretch a heartbeat longer before lifting her hand, palm open to the crowd. "Please welcome," she said, her voice steady but vibrating with something deeper. "A woman who has turned the courtroom into a battlefield for justice. A rising symbol of courage against centuries of silence. Representative Jasmine Crockett." A wave of soft applause, reverent and restrained, rippled through the audience. Without waiting for the sound to fade, the host turned, her other hand sweeping toward the opposite side. And beside her, she continued, her voice now thick with unspoken admiration, an artist who carries resilience in every step she takes, a woman whose light has never demanded the spotlight, yet has illuminated millions, Sandra Bullock. The applause grew, not louder, but heavier, as if the very walls were honoring what words could not contain. And for a moment, the air between those two empty chairs seemed to flicker, like a spark waiting for a match. The applause did not so much die as it was swallowed whole by a sudden, taut silence. A silence so complete it seemed the walls themselves were listening. Out of opposite wings, Jasmine Crockett and Sandra Bullock appeared, two women molded by different wars, but walking now toward the same center of gravity. Jasmine's steps were deliberate, each footfall a silent refusal to ever bow again. Her tailored black suit cut a sharp line through the golden mist, the subtle glint of a silver pin at her collar catching the light like a quiet rebellion. Sandra's movement was fluid but heavy with memory, the kind of poise only those who had survived 1,000 quiet humiliations could wear without bitterness. As they drew closer, the overhead lights shifted to a whiter, harsher brilliance, stripping away any room for illusions. Here they were, exposed, unfiltered, undeniable. They stopped just short of each other, close enough that even the air between them seemed to hum with the weight of battles fought behind closed doors, the wars that never made headlines but carved trenches in their lives. Jasmine raised her hand first, steady, no hesitation. Sandra reached out without blinking, and when their hands met, it wasn't a handshake. It was an exchange of something harder to name. Recognition, respect, a covenant without words. Jasmine's eyes, dark and burning, held no apology for the weight she carried. Sandra's gaze, warm but unflinching, answered with the quiet fierceness of a woman who knew too well how the world mistook survival for luck. The room remained suspended in a breathless pause as Sandra leaned forward, her voice cutting through the charged air. Justice needs a face, and Jasmine, you are that face. Jasmine's mouth curved upward, not into a polite smile, but into something deeper, a small, immovable victory. She replied, her voice low but ringing clear to the furthest walls. And humanity needs storytellers like you. The air between them still buzzed with the weight of that exchange, but Sandra did not let it break her focus. She took one small step toward the microphone, her shoulders squared against the invisible pressure, as if bracing for a storm she had weathered too many times before. Her voice came out steady, but behind it was the exhaustion of a woman who had spent her life pushing against walls that refused to budge. Before Hollywood, Sandra said, her words landing heavy and deliberate, there was a little girl growing up in small-town Virginia where having a German mother and speaking broken English made me a target before I even understood why. She let that hang for a breath, her jaw clenching as the memory tightened around her ribs. I learned early that it didn't matter how hard you worked or how kind you were. The wrong accent, the wrong face, the wrong bloodline was enough to make you invisible. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, nails digging into her palms, but she didn't flinch. And when I finally reached Hollywood, she continued, her voice sharpening like a blade, I realized the game had only changed its costume. The expectations were still the same. She paused, locking eyes with the front row before adding, most of you know me through the roles I've played, her tone even, but edged with something rawer underneath. But what you don't see is the fight behind every character. What you don't see, she said, her hand closing loosely into a fist at her side, is that behind every woman I portrayed was a woman still fighting to exist on her own terms. The spotlight sharpened around her, outlining the tension in her frame, the tiny flecks of muscle in her jaw as she pushed the words forward. Hollywood, she continued, letting the word hang like a loaded weapon, is a place that teaches you early that pretty is safer than real, that silent is easier than honest. She let the audience sit in that truth for a beat, the silence humming like a live wire stretched across the room. Every audition, every set, every smile they asked for, there was always a cost. Her voice didn't waver. And sometimes, she said, her eyes lifting to meet the crowd without flinching, the greatest role you play is surviving yourself. She let her words hang for a long moment, And when she spoke again, her voice had lost all polish. It was just raw truth now. "I still remember the smell of that room," Sandra said quietly. "Old carpet, cheap coffee, papers scattered across the table like they didn't care who walked in." She gave a tight, humorless smile. "I was 19, wearing a black dress my mom had saved up for, shoes too tight because we couldn't afford new ones." Her hands opened slightly as if releasing the memory into the room. "I thought if I walked in with enough hope, with enough heart, maybe they'd see past everything else." She paused, the silence pressing closer. "But they didn't even let me read. One of them just looked up, barely glanced at me and said, 'You're not what America looks like.'" Sandra's jaw tightened, and for a second her voice thinned, but she kept it steady. Because to them, America had one face, one sound, one perfect version, and a girl with a German last name, a trace of an accent, and a story that didn't fit their billboard dreams didn't belong. She exhaled hard through her nose. No anger in his voice, no hesitation, just a fact, like he was telling me the sky was blue. She stood there frozen. I said thank you. I smiled. I walked out. And for a long time after that, I thought, maybe if I could sound less foreign, seem less different, maybe I'd get to stay. For a heartbeat after Sandra's words fell away, the hall stayed frozen, as if even the air itself had forgotten how to move. A thick, heavy silence pressed down from the ceiling to the floor, swallowing the space between every heartbeat, every breath. In the audience, rows of faces remained still, but the pain was visible, eyes glistening with unshed tears, hands gripping the arms of their chairs, as if to anchor themselves against the sudden weight in the room. The low lights caught the shimmer of moisture in dozens of eyes, making the crowd look like a sea of stars trying not to fall. Near the stage, the host bowed her head slightly, her hands folded tight against her notes, eyes shimmering with the quiet ache of someone who had seen too much and still wasn't prepared for this. At the side of the stage, Jasmine Crockett lowered her head in a silent nod, her gaze locking on Sandra, not with pity, but with a fierce, quiet respect, as if acknowledging a wound she knew all too well. The moment stretched, taut and breathless, the kind of silence that was louder than applause, louder than any cheer could have been. No one spoke. No one dared. It was a silence built not from fear, but from the shared understanding that truth, raw and unpolished, had just stood before them, and none of them could ever pretend it hadn't. The weight of Sandra's story still hung in the air, like smoke when Jasmine Crockett slowly rose from her chair, the motion smooth, controlled, as if peeling herself free from something heavy pressing down on her chest. She didn't glance around. She didn't rush to the microphone. Every step she took across the stage was deliberate, cutting through the thick, electric silence that clung to the room. The faint click of her heels echoed across the marble floor, each sound sharp and lonely. And for a moment it felt like time itself had slowed to watch her walk. When she reached the center, she stood still, hands loose at her sides, head held high, not stiff with pride, but steady with something deeper, something earned. She breathed in once, slowly, feeling the collective weight of the room settle onto her shoulders, and she didn't flinch. "I didn't grow up thinking I'd be a lawyer," Jasmine said, her voice calm, low, but strong enough to cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "I didn't grow up thinking I'd be anything they put in textbooks." She let the words sit for a beat, not filling the silence, but sharpening it. "Where I come from, you were taught to keep your head down, to survive, to make yourself small enough that the world wouldn't notice you, and if it did, to pray it passed you by without breaking you." She smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it, only the memory of too many days spent learning how to disappear. "My mother worked 3 jobs most of her life," Jasmine continued, her voice steady. "Not to get ahead, just to stay in place. She taught me how to read sitting on the cracked steps of an old apartment building where the paint peeled off the walls like skin. She taught me how to listen with my eyes when people wouldn't speak to me because of how I looked." Jasmine's fingers flexed once at her side, the movement small but visible, like a ripple breaking across the surface of something vast and deep. "By the time I was a teenager, I knew exactly where I fit in the world, And it wasn't at the head of any table. She paused, breathing in the memory of those early years, the worn textbooks, the teachers who forgot her name, the security guards who watched her longer than anyone else. College wasn't a promise for kids like me, she said, her voice soft but edged with steel. It was a dare. It was a fight you waged with every breath, every test, every sideways glance that said, "Are you sure you belong here?" And even if you made it in, she added, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, you knew you had to be twice as good for half the recognition, and that sometimes even that wouldn't be enough. Jasmine shifted her weight, standing a little taller without even realizing it. Law school wasn't some dream come true either. It was a battlefield. Every day you walked into rooms where nobody looked like you, where your presence felt like a mistake they hadn't corrected yet. I learned quickly how to carry my books, my arguments, my silence, like armor. I learned how to sit through professors questioning why I was even there, how to watch classmates slide their chairs a little further away without saying a word. You don't forget things like that. You carry them. They shape the way you stand, the way you speak, the way you smile when you're dying inside but refuse to show it. She exhaled, a small, almost invisible motion, but her shoulders stayed square. And then you graduate. You pass the bar. You hang your degree on the wall. She paused, shaking her head slowly, her earrings catching the light like tiny flashes of defiance. And you realize the fight isn't over. It's just changed uniforms. Jasmine's voice dropped slightly, heavier now, dragging every ear in the room closer. You walk into courtrooms built by people who never imagined someone like you would stand behind the plaintiff's table. You feel it the second you step through the door, the subtle hush, the way heads turn, the tightening of shoulders that says louder than words, "Not here, not you." Judges who smile a little too coldly, opposing counsel who talk over you, who assume you're the assistant, the intern, the mistake. Clients who hesitate because somewhere along the way, they were taught that justice doesn't have brown skin or a woman's voice. She let the silence crackle a moment longer before continuing. You get used to it. You don't excuse it. You don't forget it. But you learn how to walk through it like smoke, refusing to let it stick, refusing to let it smother you. Her hands, still relaxed at her sides, curled briefly into fists and then loosened again, a tiny rhythm of control learned over too many years. I faced it in courtrooms. I faced it at campaign rallies. I faced it in green rooms before debates, where people asked if I was angry before I even spoke a word, where they warned me to smile more so I wouldn't scare anyone. Jasmine smiled now, a small, knowing curve of the lips that carried 1,000 battles behind it. As if justice needed to be soft, as if truth needed to ask permission. The lights above her seemed to narrow, pulling the world into a tighter focus around the small woman standing alone in the center of the stage. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words landed like hammer blows in the stillness. I've been told to be quiet more times than I can count, to wait my turn, to tone it down, to fit better into the spaces they built without me in mind. Jasmine stepped slightly forward, as if physically refusing to stay in the space they would have assigned her. But here's the thing, she said, her voice a little lower now, steady and undeniable. I didn't come here to be invisible. I didn't fight my way here just to survive by making myself small again. She paused, breathing in deep, her chest rising and falling slowly in the heavy air. Then she lifted her chin, her gaze locking across the room with the full force of someone who had nothing left to prove. I chose to fight, Jasmine said, her voice clear and ringing through the silence. Not by screaming louder, but by standing taller. For a moment, Jasmine's words seemed to slice the air clean open, leaving behind a silence so sharp it almost hurt to breathe. Then, without warning, the room erupted, not in chaotic noise, but in a single, rising wave of applause, crashing down like a storm against the walls. Hands clapped together with the kind of force that wasn't about politeness. It was about recognition, about the raw, aching need to honor what had just been laid bare. Some people stood without even realizing it, driven upward by something bigger than themselves, while others pounded their hands against the chair arms like trying to summon thunder. At the edge of the stage, the host lowered her head slightly, blinking rapidly as her fingers tightened around each other, as if threading a silent prayer through trembling hands. Her eyes shimmered under the soft lights, catching and holding back the flood she could not voice. Near the front, Sandra Bullock dipped her head in a slow, deliberate bow, her chest rising on a shaky breath, her face lit not with pity, but with a fierce, unshakable pride. She watched Jasmine the way a soldier watches another survivor. No words needed, only the understanding carved out by battle. The applause rolled on, wave after wave, as if the crowd was trying, somehow, to lift Jasmine higher, with nothing but the sheer force of their hands and their hope. The thunder of applause finally began to ebb, but the energy in the room didn't fade. It coiled tighter, sharper, as if something unseen was about to break open. Across the stage, Jasmine and Sandra locked eyes, a silent bridge forming between them, built not from fame or titles, but from the familiar weight of scars earned in different battles. Jasmine took a single step back, her chest rising with a steady breath, and in that space Sandra mirrored her, the two women standing opposite but equal, like reflections forged under different storms. No words passed between them yet. They didn't need them. The look they shared spoke louder than any speech ever could. It said, "I know what it costs. I know what it takes to keep standing." The air between them thickened, charged with the kind of recognition only those who have been tested by fire could understand. It wasn't the applause that bound them. It was the knowledge that injustice had been both their enemy and their forge. Slowly, without ceremony, Jasmine lifted her chin, and Sandra answered with the smallest nod, a silent agreement written in a language built from endurance. They stood there, two pillars against a history that had tried to grind them down, sharing an unspoken truth. You don't survive by avoiding injustice. You survive by making it your reason to move forward, not your excuse to stop. The understanding between them didn't just linger. It hardened into a bond stronger than applause, heavier than words. Sandra was the first to speak, her voice steady, but laced with the kind of sorrow that never fully leaves. "There was a time," she said, "when I was told I was lucky. Lucky just to be allowed into rooms where people who looked like me were once turned away." She let that sit, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides. "But luck wasn't why I was there, and I knew it. Luck doesn't explain why some kids sit in broken classrooms while others sit in buildings named after donors." She glanced out over the crowd, her gaze sharp. "So I started funding scholarships, not for the kids already picked, already polished, already told they belong, but for the kids who worked twice as hard for half the praise, for the kids whose names nobody remembered once they left the room." The air shifted, the weight of that truth sinking into the audience like a stone into still water. Jasmine stepped forward next, her movements slow, deliberate, like each word she was about to say had been carried a long, long way. "And I fought," she said, her voice low but fierce, "to pass a law for single mothers. Women who weren't just raising children, but carrying entire lives on their backs while being told they were burdens." She shook her head once, slow and unflinching. They didn't need pity, they didn't need charity. They needed a system that stopped punishing them for surviving. Jasmine's hands unfolded at her sides, steady and sure. "I didn't just want to create a seat at the table. I wanted to rip the damn table out of the ground and build something better where no one had to beg for a place." The applause didn't so much fade as it was swallowed whole by the room itself, leaving behind a silence thick enough to feel on the skin. The lights overhead seemed dimmer somehow, not by design but by the sheer weight of everything that had been said and everything that still hung unsaid between the rows of waiting faces. The host shifted in her seat, her hands tightening around the stack of cue cards she hadn't touched in minutes. For a second it looked as if she might simply thank them and close the evening on that towering note. But something in the room demanded more, demanded truth without polish, without applause. She lifted her head slowly, meeting the eyes of the two women standing side by side, and her voice when it came was soft but cuttingly clear. "If you could name it," she said, almost a whisper against the fragile hush, "what is your greatest fear?" The words floated out into the room, and it was as if every breath was drawn in at once and then held, frozen, as if the walls themselves leaned closer to hear. No one moved, no one coughed. It wasn't anticipation, it was reverence, and fear too, because some questions, once asked, can never be unasked. Sandra Bullock didn't answer immediately. She closed her eyes for the briefest second, as if searching the hollows of herself for the thing no role, no script had ever allowed her to name. When she opened them, there was no shield left, no distance. Only a rawness so stark it almost hurt to look at. Her voice when she spoke was quiet, but it landed with the force of something that had been waiting a lifetime to be said. That no one would care, Sandra said. No embellishment, no explanation, just the naked truth laid out like a blade. For a moment, the room didn't react. It couldn't. The answer was too simple, too devastating. It wasn't the fear of failure or of falling short. It was the deeper, colder terror that everything you fought for, every scar you wore, every silent battle you survived, might simply vanish into a world too busy to even notice. Somewhere near the back of the room, a woman pressed her hand to her mouth, her shoulders shaking silently. Near the front, a man in a tailored suit stared down at his lap, blinking rapidly, as if trying to erase the sting in his eyes. The room had turned into a mirror, and no one was ready for what they saw reflected there. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, not into Sandra's shadow, but alongside it, as if they were 2 points on the same unbreakable line. Her voice was lower, rougher, carrying the weight of streets and courtrooms and speeches no one wanted to hear until it was too late. "That they would care," Jasmine said, "but only after I'm gone." The air cracked around her words, not loud, not sudden, but the way ice groans under too much weight. It was the kind of sentence that didn't end when the sound stopped. It kept unraveling inside every person who heard it, pulling at something raw and buried deep. It was a different kind of fear, not of being invisible, but of being visible too late, of being praised only when it no longer mattered, when the fight was already over and the cost already paid. It was the fear of monuments built where voices had once been silenced, of apologies whispered to graves instead of shouted into the living world. The host said nothing. She couldn't. Her throat worked silently as she lowered her gaze, her hands trembling around the edges of her forgotten cards. The audience sat frozen, pinned to their seats by a gravity heavier than any speech or headline could create. Some stared straight ahead, unmoving. Others looked down at their hands, their knees, the floor. Anywhere but at the 2 women still standing in the center of the storm they had summoned into being. It was not a silence made of awkwardness. It was not a silence begging to be filled. It was a silence thick with grief and awe, a silence that tasted like metal and thunder, a silence that acknowledged the price of standing tall when the world tells you over and over again to kneel. In that moment, under the fading light, Sandra and Jasmine didn't look like a movie star and a politician. They didn't look like guests at a talk show. They looked like something older, something harder, something carved out of the stubborn refusal to break. They stood not as survivors of their own battles, but as witnesses for everyone whose battles had been forgotten. No one clapped, no one cheered, no one dared. They simply sat there, breathing the same heavy air, sharing the same unbearable knowledge that some fears are too big for speeches, too deep for applause, too real to ever be undone. The silence from the last confession still stretched across the hall like a wound when a small, tremulous voice cut through it, not loud but clean enough to shift the entire room's weight. From the back, a student rose slowly, clutching the microphone with both hands, her knuckles white with tension. She didn't look older than 20, her voice cracking slightly under the unbearable gravity of the moment. "If you could give just one piece of advice," she asked, her words trembling but unmistakably clear, "what would you tell the next generation?" For a beat, for an impossibly long heartbeat, no one moved. The question didn't fall. It landed. It pierced. It was not a child's question. It was a demand, a call thrown across generations and built from every doubt, every dream, every unspoken terror that had ever lived in a heart that didn't know if it would survive long enough to be heard. The stage for a moment seemed impossibly vast. Jasmine and Sandra stood still in it, framed by the harshness of the lights, by the weight of everything that hadn't yet been said. Sandra was the first to breathe again. And when she did, it was almost a physical effort, as if pulling air into her lungs meant pulling the weight of an entire history too. She didn't move closer to the microphone. She didn't need to. Her voice when it came was low but resonant, like a single stone dropped into a deep black well. "Don't seek perfection," she said, the words falling heavy, shaped by a lifetime of knowing exactly how easily the world weaponized flaws. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the darkened sea of faces, catching their glint, their hope, their fear. Seek purpose. She didn't explain it. She didn't soften it. She didn't pretend it was easy. Her hands stayed steady at her sides, but her whole body seemed carved from something denser than flesh. Something made from the battles fought in the quiet, brutal places where applause doesn't reach. The student in the back squeezed the microphone tighter, her shoulders hunching forward slightly, as if the sheer force of the answer had pressed down on her spine. Around her, the crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath again, afraid that even shifting in their seats might fracture the fragile, holy thing hanging between speaker and listener. Sandra's words hadn't been advice in the soft, worn-out way people often gave it. They had been a map, bloody, torn, but real. Jasmine waited a second longer, and when she spoke, her voice didn't rise. It sank. It drew the room downward with it, into a deeper kind of listening. "And remember," she said, her tone a blade honed not by anger, but by an impossible patience. "Your existence is already an act of resistance." She didn't smile. She didn't soften the blow. She stood there with her shoulders square and her eyes burning, not begging them to understand, but daring them not to. The words sliced clean, surgical, into every soul that had ever questioned whether their breathing, their standing, their simply being was enough. The walls of the grand hall seemed to contract inward around her, as if trying to swallow the truth whole and failing. Someone near the front dropped their program, the sharp slap of paper hitting the floor, the only sound brave enough to move through the electric air. A ripple ran through the audience. Not applause, not noise, but the shiver of hundreds of people realizing all at once that survival was not passive. It was not a default. It was an act of rebellion, an act of defiance against every system, every voice, every structure that ever told them they were expendable. Sandra and Jasmine stood unmoving in the center of it, two beacons against a tide that had tried, again and again, to drown them. They weren't asking for gratitude. They weren't asking for admiration. They were offering a torch, lit by scars and mistakes and unbreakable will, and daring anyone brave enough to carry it forward. The student who had asked the question looked down at the microphone in her shaking hands as if it had suddenly grown too heavy to hold. She pressed her lips together, nodded once, sharp and quick, and sat down without another word. Around her, the audience remained seated too, locked in place by a silence that was no longer heavy with sorrow, but charged with something else entirely. Responsibility. The lights overhead buzzed faintly. Someone cleared their throat but didn't speak. The world outside the hall could have been burning, flooding, ending, and no one would have noticed. In that moment, the only thing that existed was the space between two women who had fought their way into the light, and the hundreds sitting before them, realizing for the first time that it was now their fight too. No music played, no announcer interrupted, no polite applause tried to chase away the rawness of what had just unfolded. There was only the heavy, breathing silence, and the knowledge that the future had just been handed to them, not with celebration, but with a challenge. The weight of Jasmine's and Sandra's words still vibrated through the air like the low, aching hum of a struck bell when something even deeper moved between them. Something unscripted, something no spotlight could have choreographed. Sandra reached into the pocket of her jacket with slow, careful movements, as if what she held was too fragile to expose all at once. The audience held their breath without meaning to, drawn into the moment by a force they didn't fully understand. Sandra's hand emerged holding a thin silver chain, and dangling from it, catching the stage lights like a living spark, was a tiny flame-shaped pendant. She stepped closer to Jasmine, her face open, stripped of the polished grace the world usually expected of her. "This," Sandra said, her voice soft but carrying through the hall, "is for you." She didn't offer a long speech. She didn't need to. She simply placed the chain in Jasmine's open palm, letting it rest there with a gentleness that made the moment feel heavier, not lighter. "A flame," Sandra whispered, just loud enough for the first few rows to hear. "Because you carry hope into rooms that were never built to hold it." Jasmine stood motionless for a heartbeat too long, the pendant gleaming against her dark skin like a stubborn, burning star. Her fingers curled around it slowly, deliberately, as if imprinting the weight into her memory. The hall was so quiet now that the faint clink of the chain against her bracelet sounded like a drumbeat. Jasmine lifted her eyes to meet Sandra's, and in that look was a flood of things too vast for words. Gratitude, yes, but also defiance, solidarity, a recognition carved from wounds they both carried but rarely exposed. Jasmine didn't say thank you. Thank you would have been too small, too ordinary. Instead, she stepped back, her hands moving to the folds of her jacket where she had tucked something away before the show, never sure if she would find the right moment to give it. Now she knew. With steady hands, she pulled out a letter, old, creased at the corners, but lovingly preserved. She held it with both hands as she crossed the small distance between them, the way one carries something sacred. "This," Jasmine said, her voice low and trembling slightly with the effort of holding herself together, "is from my mother." She placed the letter carefully into Sandra's hands, the paper thin but weighty as stone. "She wrote it years ago," Jasmine continued, "to remind me, and anyone who would listen, what it cost for people like me to stand anywhere at all." Sandra accepted it as if it were glass, her fingers brushing over the faded ink visible even through the worn envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't have to. Some gifts are too sacred to tear open in front of a crowd. The silence that followed was different than the ones before. Not heavy with sadness or fear, but thick with something harder to name. Reverence, maybe, or responsibility. A knowing that what was exchanged between them was not jewelry or paper, but memory, pain, survival, fire. In the audience, some people pressed hand to their mouths to keep from sobbing aloud. Others simply sat frozen, feeling the weight of generations pass from one pair of hands to another. In a moment so unadorned, so raw, it felt like touching something ancient and holy. Sandra looked down once more at the letter, her lashes wet under the stage lights she didn't seem to notice anymore. Then she lifted her gaze, meeting Jasmine's with a slow, burning clarity. She tucked the letter gently to her heart with one hand, as if stitching it into herself where no one could ever take it. Jasmine, still clutching the flame pendant, responded with a nod so small it barely moved her head. But in it was the gravity of oceans, the acknowledgement of a fight still raging, still unfinished, still worth carrying forward. Neither woman spoke again. They didn't need to. Their hands had spoken. Their scars had spoken. The world, for once, had no choice but to listen. The lights above didn't swell into a triumphant glow. They softened instead, casting long shadows that stretched out across the stage like the roots of something deep, something unkillable. In that quiet, in that solemn exchange, the audience understood. The real inheritance wasn't fame, or power, or even victory. It was memory. It was the burden of remembering who built the roads you walked on, who bled so you could stand tall, who dreamed so you could dare more than survival. Sandra cradled the letter against her chest as if it were a shield. Jasmine slid the flame pendant over her head, the tiny fire settling just above her heart. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching. Hope and memory, fire and blood, the fuel and the reason, the past and the future, stitched together by two women who had long ago learned that survival alone was not enough. From the back of the room, the student who had asked the question wiped at her cheeks with the sleeve of her sweater, her face lifted toward the stage as if trying to memorize the moment, burn it into her bones. Around her, others did the same, not weeping in weakness, but in recognition, in the painful, powerful knowledge that they were being handed a torch that had never stopped burning, even when the world tried to smother it. And in that heavy, breathtaking quiet, Jasmine and Sandra stood together, not as a politician and an actress, not even as two women from different worlds, but as two flames refusing to die out, two flames refusing to be forgotten, two flames daring the world to follow them into the fire and survive. For a moment longer, after the letter had been pressed to Sandra's heart and the flame pendant had settled against Jasmine's chest, the room remained frozen in a kind of sacred stillness, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Then something shifted, subtle at first, almost invisible. A rustle of fabric, the soft scrape of chair legs against the polished floor. Without anyone speaking, without anyone signaling, the first row began to rise, slow and solemn, as if moved by a force older and deeper than applause. They stood not because protocol demanded it, but because their bodies could no longer bear to remain seated in the presence of something so painfully true. The second row followed, and then the third. And then all at once, the entire hall was on its feet, a rising tide of humanity drawn upward by something heavier than gratitude and lighter than grief. Hands began to move, almost hesitantly at first, palms meeting in slow rhythmic claps that echoed like the first tentative heartbeats after a long silence. But the sound grew, gathering momentum like a storm, gaining strength over open water. It wasn't just noise. It was an offering, a thunderous, relentless outpouring of something that words could no longer contain. People clapped until their hands stung, until their arms ached, until it felt like they could pound their very souls into the air to make sure Jasmine and Sandra understood. We see you, we hear you, we will not forget. In the crowd, tears welled up and spilled freely, not from pity, never pity, but from something rawer, something cleaner, hope, reverence, a fierce, aching respect for battles fought in silence, for victories that came without parades, for scars carried without ever asking for applause. A young man in the front row wiped his face roughly with the sleeve of his jacket, blinking fast, while beside him an older woman pressed a shaking hand to her chest, her mouth trembling with words she could not form. On stage, Jasmine and Sandra didn't smile. They didn't bow. They simply stood there, allowing the weight of what was happening to crash over them without shielding themselves, without shrinking away. The flame around Jasmine's neck caught the light and flickered with every tremor in the air, a living symbol of the fire no one had been able to extinguish. Sandra's fingers stayed curled lightly around the letter, the fragile paper somehow looking stronger now than steel. They remained still, unyielding, like two monuments carved out of everything the world had tried and failed to erase. The applause didn't dip, didn't weaken. It roared, steady and unstoppable, not needing an MC, not needing a cue. This was not celebration. This was consecration. The sound wrapped around them like armor, like a vow made not in polite words, but in the blood and breath of everyone standing. The crowd was not merely applauding them. They were applauding every woman who had been told she was too loud, too soft, too angry, too ambitious. Every man who had been overlooked because of the shape of his name, the color of his skin. Every child who still sat in classrooms wondering if the future had room for them. In the balcony, an old man with silver hair and tired eyes stood with difficulty, his hands clapping in slow, deliberate rhythm, a tear carving a clean line through the wrinkles of his weathered face. Near the exit doors, a group of students locked hands together, lifting them into the air as if refusing to let the world pull them back down into silence. The entire hall pulsed with the sound, an endless, undulating wave of defiance and hope woven together so tightly that it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The lights above them seemed to shimmer, distorted through the wet eyes of hundreds, turning the room into something almost mythic, almost beyond real time. It wasn't just an audience anymore. It was a movement, a living body made from the pieces of every broken promise, every shattered dream, now forged into something unbreakable. Sandra turned her head slightly, just enough to catch Jasmine's eyes across the small space between them. No words passed, no gestures, just a look, burning, fierce, and quietly invincible, that said, "We are not alone anymore." Jasmine nodded once, slow and deliberate, her hand lifting to brush the flame pendant, as if anchoring herself to the moment. Around them the applause raged on, not frantic, not chaotic, but steady and full, like a heartbeat that had found its rhythm after too many years of fighting to be heard. It filled every corner of the great hall, seeped into the cracks of the marble, wound itself into the beams of the ceiling until it seemed the very building was breathing with them. And still, no one sat down. Because sometimes standing is the only language the heart understands. Because sometimes clapping is not about noise. It's about bearing witness. Because sometimes in the face of injustice that almost won, you rise, you clap, and you refuse to sit back down. The applause, endless and thunderous, still rolled through the grand hall like a living ocean. But somewhere within that roar, something softer began to rise. A different current, invisible but undeniable. It wasn't orchestrated, it wasn't planned. It was something ancient moving through the bones of every person standing there. Something too big, too real to be contained by sound. Jasmine and Sandra, still standing at the center of the storm, turned toward each other almost as if pulled by gravity. Neither rushed, neither smiled. This wasn't a photo opportunity. This was the slow, inevitable collision of two lives that had burned through too many walls not to recognize the fire burning in the other. Jasmine took one step forward, then another, the pendant against her chest catching the light with every heartbeat. Sandra mirrored her, the old letter still pressed protectively against her heart. The space between them, so full of everything unspoken, narrowed until finally, their arms wrapped around each other. It wasn't a graceful embrace. It wasn't polished or posed. It was rough around the edges, full of the kind of rawness that only survivors can share. Jasmine's forehead rested against Sandra's shoulder for just a moment longer than expected. Sandra's hand gripped Jasmine's back, firm and trembling all at once, as if anchoring herself to the only other person who knew what it cost to keep standing when the world keeps asking you to kneel. The room, still vibrating with the force of so many hands clapping, seemed to exhale as one. The applause didn't stop, but it softened, as if bowing its head before the gravity of the moment unfolding in front of them. In that single powerful embrace, an entire history flickered to life. The silent screams, the closed doors, the betrayals survived, and the victories nobody bothered to record. It was an embrace heavy with the weight of women who had been told to sit down, to smile more, to be grateful for the crumbs they were thrown. It was an embrace that knew the cost of being too loud, too brave, too much. For a long moment, it was just them, two flames, two survivors, two stubborn, beautiful acts of defiance locked together in a bond forged not by circumstances, but by choice. Slowly, Sandra pulled back first, her hands still resting on Jasmine's shoulders, her eyes shining, not with sadness, but with something fiercer. Pride, respect, hope carved from the broken bones of 1,000 rejections. Jasmine responded with a nod so small it was almost imperceptible, but in it was a universe of understanding. They didn't need to speak. They had already said everything worth saying. The house lights began to lower, not abruptly, but with a slow, solemn grace, like the sun slipping below a horizon it refuses to fully abandon. Shadows stretched longer across the stage, wrapping the two women in a cocoon of warm, golden half-light. Somewhere above them, the rigging creaked softly as spotlights dimmed, the ceiling seeming to bow under the enormity of what had just transpired. At the very edge of the stage, the host finally stepped forward, her movements reverent, her voice thick but unbroken when she spoke. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't shuffle her cards. She simply raised the microphone to her lips and let the words fall, like the final stones in the foundation of something much bigger than a single night. Tonight wasn't just a conversation, she said, her voice carrying with a quiet, devastating force that cut clean through the final ripples of applause. It was the meeting of two fires, and the world just got a little brighter. There was no dramatic musical cue, no swelling strings, just the steady rhythmic beating of hundreds of hearts pounding in time with a truth that didn't need to be amplified to be heard. The audience remained standing, not out of habit now, but out of reverence. Some reached for each other's hands, weaving a net of silent solidarity across the hall. Others pressed palms to their chests, feeling the thrum of a heartbeat they had nearly forgotten belonged to something bigger than themselves. On stage, Jasmine and Sandra turned slowly toward the crowd. They didn't wave. They didn't bow. They simply stood there shoulder to shoulder, breathing together, Two pillars carved not from marble, but from resistance, endurance, and hope. The glow of the flame pendant flickered faintly against Jasmine's skin. Sandra's fingers traced the edge of the old letter once more, before letting it settle against her heart where it belonged. The lights dipped lower, bathing the scene in a soft, reverent twilight. In the dimness, faces blurred together, not because they were forgotten, but because, in that moment, individuality gave way to something collective, something shared. The recognition that survival is not a solitary act. It is a relay, a carrying of torches through darkness thicker than words can describe. As the final spotlight narrowed and dimmed to black, a single endless moment of breathless unity remained, hanging in the darkness like the after-image of a flame, burned into closed eyes. It was a moment no photograph could capture, no headline could summarize, no history book could fully explain. It was the sound of a world that had, if only for a heartbeat, remembered how to feel again. And somewhere, deep inside the marrow of everyone present, a tiny flame caught and stayed lit. The applause still echoed long after the last spotlight dimmed. It clung to the marble pillars, vibrated along the velvet seats, hung suspended in the high-arched ceiling like smoke from a sacred fire no one dared to breathe too hard against. Outside the grand hall, the night waited, vast and heavy, but inside no one moved yet. No one reached for their coats. No one turned to leave. They stood there, hundreds of bodies pressed by invisible hands into stillness, hearts pounding in a rhythm set not by music, but by memory. Jasmine and Sandra had already disappeared behind the heavy velvet curtain, swallowed by the darkness beyond the stage. But their absence didn't empty the room. If anything, it filled it, thicker, denser, as if their leaving had carved an outline around every soul left standing, forcing each one to see themselves more clearly than before. The air was different now. It wasn't the air of celebration, of victory. It was the slow, aching afterglow of survival, of truth being planted deep enough to change the way breath entered the lungs. People shifted in place without realizing it, the smallest movements exaggerated in the solemn hush. A cough echoed like a thunderclap. A dropped program fluttered down like a wounded bird. Footsteps dared not sound yet. Even the creak of old wood under shifting weight seemed too loud, too intrusive, like scratching across the face of something sacred. Near the back of the hall, a young man in a faded denim jacket turned his baseball cap slowly in his hands, his knuckles gone white. He stared down at the worn brim as if trying to make sense of the weight now pressing against his chest. A weight he hadn't entered the room knowing he would carry home. Beside him, a woman with streaks of silver in her tightly braided hair closed her eyes, the corners of her mouth quivering, not from sadness, but from the unbearable pressure of hope, sharp and new and almost too much to contain. At the front, a small group of students sat huddled together, their bodies leaning in unconsciously as if to shield the fragile ember of inspiration sparked somewhere deep inside them. One girl, barely out of her teens, wiped at her cheeks with the sleeve of her oversized sweatshirt, leaving damp streaks like war paint across her skin. Her shoulders trembled, but her spine stayed straight, as if some part of her understood instinctively that crying wasn't weakness. It was proof she had heard, proof she was awake. The ushers by the exit stood still, hats in hand, their faces a strange mixture of humility and awe. They had guided thousands through these doors before, audiences who had laughed, cheered, applauded, and left. But tonight was different. Tonight, they were witnesses, not staff. Tonight, they weren't managing a crowd. They were part of a congregation. And outside, past the thick wooden doors, the city pulsed and churned and glittered as always. But even the taxis rushing past, the neon flashing above greasy diners, the sirens slicing through distant streets, seemed dulled somehow, as if the heartbeat of the world had stumbled for a second, jarred by something it couldn't quite name. On the marble steps leading down to the street, small clusters began to gather. No one jostled. No one shoved their way forward. They moved like sleepwalkers caught between two realities, the one they had walked in carrying and the one they now carried inside them. Conversations started and died in half-formed whispers. Some people touched each other's arms lightly, as if anchoring themselves against being swept away by the enormity of what they felt. Near the edge of the crowd, a middle-aged man in a battered work jacket pulled out a small, crumpled notebook from his pocket. He stared at it for a long time, thumb rubbing against the frayed edges, before slowly, painstakingly, he began to write, his hand trembling so badly he had to brace it against his knee. Behind him, a mother lifted her toddler into her arms, pressing the child's tiny head against her chest, as if trying to protect the innocence that had not yet learned how much the world could wound. It would have been easy for the moment to collapse under its own gravity, to dissipate into polite nods and murmured goodbyes. But it didn't. Something else took root instead, a stubborn, flickering pulse that passed from one heart to another with each silent glance, each tear wiped away, each clenched fist held steady at someone's side. Back inside the hall, the faint hum of the cooling systems kicking on stirred the curtains along the stage. The floor, littered with forgotten programs and handouts, looked strangely dignified, like a battlefield after the smoke had cleared. No grand speeches, no triumphant banners, just the heavy, undeniable residue of something real having happened. In a quiet corner near the coat racks, a teenage boy leaned against the wall, his head bowed, one earbud dangling forgotten from his jacket. He wasn't scrolling through his phone. He wasn't texting. He was just standing there, letting the night seep into him the way rain seeps into dry earth, knowing without understanding that nothing inside him would ever feel quite the same again. Across the street, under the flickering yellow halo of a broken street lamp, an old woman wiped her eyes with the edge of her scarf and turned her face up to the sky. She stayed there a long time, mouth moving silently, perhaps in prayer, perhaps just shaping the names of people she wished had lived to see this night. The world outside would not stop for them. Bills would still need paying. Jobs would still grind on. Wars would still rage and politics would still rot, and heartbreak would still come too often. But deep under the skin of it all, something had shifted. Maybe just a fraction, maybe just a breath. But shifts like that are how revolutions begin. Not with banners, not with gunshots, but with a room full of people carrying a silence heavy enough to crack open the bones of the world. Minutes passed, maybe hours. It was hard to tell. Time had become elastic, stretching out thin and taut across the memories now burning themselves into the marrow of everyone standing there. And then, slowly, like a tide pulling itself back from a flooded shore, they began to move again. Small steps, quiet murmurs. Hands brushed along banisters worn smooth by the touch of thousands who had come before them. Feet found their way down the steps not with hurry but with reverence. Eyes met in brief, blazing glances. Strangers offering each other promises without words. No one shouted. No one called for attention. There was no need. Because tonight, something had been passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, not as a burden, but as a birthright. Not as a weight to crush them, but as a fire to carry. And deep in that fire, still flickering stubbornly against the night, lived a simple, brutal, beautiful truth. Hope does not ask to be invited. It demands to be carried, and once lit, it refuses to go quietly. The city had changed, but not the way maps would show. It wasn't in the new glass towers scraping the sky, or the endless hum of electric cars replacing the old gasoline growl. It was deeper than that, under the pavement, inside the bones of the people moving through the streets, with heads higher, backs straighter. In a corner of the city most tourists never found, a small auditorium buzzed with a kind of restless electric energy that no stage lights could fully capture. The room wasn't grand, no marble pillars, no velvet curtains, just battered folding chairs lined up in uneven rows. A patchwork of bodies crammed shoulder to shoulder, young and old, rich and poor, black, brown, and white, stitched together not by programs or ticket stubs, but by something harder to name. Something they had carried here, quietly, stubbornly, through years that had not always been kind. At the front of the room stood a woman, young, fierce-eyed, her hands trembling just slightly as she gripped the sides of the old wooden podium. Around her neck hung a silver flame, worn smooth by years of touch. In her pocket, folded neatly, was a letter written long before she was born, its edges yellowed, its words still sharp enough to cut. She didn't speak right away. She stood there, breathing in the crowd, letting the silence settle deep and sure into the space between them. The air buzzed with the kind of expectation that only comes when people understand that what they are about to witness is not performance, but continuation. At the back of the room, leaning against a chipped column, a man in a gray jacket watched with arms folded tight against his chest. His face was lined now, his hair thinner, but his eyes held the same unyielding flame he had carried out of a different hall 5 years earlier. He had been there the night Jasmine and Sandra stood side by side. And though the world had spun on, and headlines had risen and fallen like tides, he had never let that night leave him. It had burrowed into his blood, changed his footsteps, changed what he demanded of himself. On the walls of the small room, tacked up posters fluttered in the weak draft from a busted vent. They showed no famous faces, no celebrities, just ordinary people holding signs, marching, voting, fighting, faces tired but defiant, words hand-scrawled and messy but real. Hope is an action, silence is consent, stand tall. The young woman at the podium finally spoke, her voice clear, cutting through the crowded heat like a blade honed, not by anger, but by purpose. She didn't tell them to be fearless. She didn't promise them it would be easy. She told them what Jasmine and Sandra had taught her, what she carried now, stitched into the marrow of her being. "You were never meant to wait for someone else to light the fire," she said, her hand brushing the flame pendant at her throat. "You are the fire." A shudder moved through the room, an almost imperceptible ripple as bodies leaned forward, as fists clenched tighter, as hearts remembered how to beat against the numbness the world had tried so long to teach them. No one stood up and cheered. No one needed to. They simply listened, breathing together, letting the truth settle heavy and permanent into the parts of themselves that would not be moved. Outside, the night stretched deep and wide, heavy with the weight of too many battles still waiting to be fought. But inside this room, a new fire caught, invisible but undeniable, passed from voice to voice, hand to hand, future to future. And somewhere under the scarred surface of the city, under the broken sidewalks and faded murals, something impossible was still burning. Not in spite of the world, but because of it. It had never been about one night. It had never been about two women. It had always been about what happens next. And it was happening now. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.